This is a moment when we need people to show up. And some of the things we need people to do are the simplest things in the world. It is just show up in body, mind, and spirit, express love and support, and help make sure that these frontline organizations that are going to be working directly with people to help people connect with resources have the funding they need, have the volunteer base they need, and have the support they need to not just sustain their programming, but to expand it, because that's what's going to need to happen as we look to the 4 years ahead. But get involved. We know a majority of Americans are with us, and this is about building a movement that truly reflects that. And so there's room at the table for you, and we'd love to have you with us.
I'm Kimberly Atkins-Storr, and this is Justice by Design. Well, a lot has happened this week as a new federal administration has taken power and taken a lot of actions that target a lot of people, including LGBTQ plus Americans. A lot of these target their civil rights. They make it more difficult for them to live, to work, to be free, to have the same promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And while the effects are rippling nationwide, they are particularly difficult in the South, where more than a third of all LGBTQ Americans live. So today I am honored to be joined by Jasmine Beach-Ferrara, who is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for Southern Equality. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining.
It's great to be with you, and thanks for having me on.
So first, before we start our conversation, tell our listeners a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just on a personal note, I'm a queer Southerner. My wife and I are raising 3 kids here in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a minister in the United Church of Christ and very honored to be the executive director of the Campaign for Southern Equality. We're an organization that's based in Western North Carolina, but we work all across the South and, in fact, at this point, across the country to advocate for the legal and lived equality of LGBTQ folks. And we do that through a range of programs and services. Over the years, that's everything from litigation being in the courts to protesting in the streets to direct services. In fact, right now we are hosting a supply center here in Asheville. It's something we started doing in the wake of Hurricane Helene and then have continued doing in the wake of Trump 2.0. Focused on delivering direct resources to LGBTQ folks, information about their rights, and also creating a space of community and love for folks to experience in this climate.
So help us get an understanding of why in the South the needs might be different, aside from the fact that there are more LGBTQ folks in the South than any other region in America. That's something I don't think I realized until preparing for this conversation. Talk a little bit about why this organization was founded and what the needs then were and how they look now.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for lifting that up. A lot of folks have never heard that a third of all LGBTQ Americans live here in the South. And when you drill down a little further, our community is diverse in race, diverse in geography, living in small rural farming towns, living in the biggest metro areas of the South, living across the full economic spectrum, and certainly diverse in gender. At the same time, we know that queer folks in the South have long experienced significant and profound disparities when it comes to income, when it comes to healthcare access and healthcare outcomes, and certainly when it comes to rights and protections. When we founded CSE, Campaign for Southern Equality, in 2011, it really was born out of a lot of the experiences of queer folks who had come of age and grown up in the South and for whom the South is home. That's my story. And we were really pushing back against and resisting the narrative that if you were queer and from the South, you either fled or you lived your life in the shadows. And those were really the 2 options: to evacuate or to, in some way, assimilate. And what we knew to be true was actually that queer folks then and now, and for decades and centuries prior, had been living in the South. And part of the work we do has always been about that reclamation of the South as home, and also about a strategic analysis that, some of the deepest work for civil rights progress in our country, whether it's around racial justice, economic justice, immigration issues, or queer issues, is going to be rooted in the South,
Yeah.
where those issues play out in an intertwined way in the lives of so many. So we are proud to be here in the South, and also very clear-sighted about the specific challenges and disparities. And just to name two before we kind of dive deeper into the conversation, you know, the South has always been a kind of testing ground for hostile legislation when it comes to LGBTQ folks. And in the last few years on the ground here, we've been living through what I would consider the vilest and most aggressive attack on LGBTQ people, and particularly transgender youth, that we've ever seen in our country. And the South has been the place where that effort has been most focused and where the greatest preponderance of those bills have actually become law. So what we are likely to start seeing in various ways on the federal level is a reality that has been sort of prefigured in the South. And our community in the face of that is feeling all the things you'd imagine, from fear and anxiety to strength and grit and courage. We know how to live our lives in the context of discriminatory laws and fight back against those laws, and also live into truths that transcend the limitations of the law at any given moment. So there's a lot in the mix. There always is when you're talking about the South, and there always is when you're talking about queer folks, and
Yeah.
especially when you bring those two together.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I want to dig in a little bit more into that intersectionality in this discussion, because I think that's really important. But first, I want to focus a little bit, as you talked about, center the discussion for a bit on trans Americans, and particularly trans young Americans. I could see from the data from CSE's website that something like 500,000 trans adults are in the South, but that's not counting the young people. And I have to say, in the last week since the inauguration, the messages that I've been hearing from friends and family most are out of concern for their trans and non-binary young people in their lives and their families, and my family. Um, Talk a little bit about the specific needs of trans folks already in the South, but given the additional layer of executive orders that will that threaten to further strip away their civil rights.
Absolutely. And I'll get to the laws and policies and action steps in a moment. I want to
Yeah.
just start by saying the thing that we try to say every single place we can to anyone we can say it to, which is that we want trans young people, queer young people, trans adults to hear that they're loved, that they are not alone, that there are millions and millions, in fact, a majority of Americans, and a growing majority, who believe in their equality and dignity and are ready to fight for that. And I think at a time when we have the president of the country using that platform as a bully pulpit to target kids, which is unfathomable, right? But also to target kids who are small in number. It's so critically important that we double and triple down on love. And also double and triple down on strategic support and action, and bringing the muscle of resources to that love. So in terms of specific issues, access to gender affirming healthcare, which is medically recommended for trans folks over their life cycles, is one of the greatest points of concern that we have. And we have in the last 2 years seen 26 states pass some versions of bans on gender affirming care for young trans folks. There's been a lot of misinformation about the issues surrounding this. And I think it's critically important for people to understand that this is about the right of families and the responsibility and duty of physicians to provide the care that is best for an individual child. And that's what gender affirming care is. And anyone who accepts the reality that trans adults exist has to also accept the reality that those trans adults were once kids. And there was a point at which they understood this about themselves and began trying to express or communicate it in one way or another. And the great cultural sea change we've seen is that while 20 to 30 years ago, kids who tried to communicate that were typically silenced, excluded, told to hide that part of themselves, we now have a generation, thankfully, of parents, teachers, medical providers, ministers, who, when they hear a child say that, say, we love you, we see you, and we're here to walk with you. And that fundamentally is what gender affirming care is about. At the Campaign for Southern Equality, we launched a project called the Trans Youth Emergency Project as it became apparent that these bans were about to start passing. And we expanded it first across the South and now across the nation so that we're providing direct assistance to the families of trans youth in any state where a ban has passed. We provide emergency funding so they can gas up the car and drive to a state where they can safely access health care for their kiddo, their young person. We provide navigation support to identify providers that they can actually see and updates about the status of the law. So that's one key resource that we are standing up and committed to expanding to meet the needs of as many families as approach us. There are a lot of other incredible organizations across the South and across the country responding to the litany of needs that exist for trans adults also around access to healthcare. We have seen restrictions on care regarding Medicaid coverage for care, or attempts to restrict the type of provider who can actually provide gender affirming care to adults in Florida. We have a lot of concern about those types of moves happening in other states, and we're also closely watching, of course, everything happening federally. Across the LGBTQ movement, people will be fighting in the courts, in legislatures, at every level of government to protect the rights and access that are there, and then to stand up essentially mutual aid and direct services to assist people if restrictions to care are passed. What we fundamentally see this as essentially is wanting to preserve pathways to safe gender affirming care for people across the life cycle. And as restrictions are passed, it requires creating new pathways and working together at the movement level to ensure that people have the resources they need for the travel that may be involved, or what happens when their insurance coverage no longer covers care, patient care funds, all those kinds of things. We've talked a lot about healthcare here. There are other issues related to name changes, identification, passports, gender marker changes, and then also the issues of LGBTQ law and family protections, which also include trans folks and families with trans folks. So we can go in any direction that you want as we move forward.
Well, there's so many. I mean, that gets to some of the intersectionality issues, because you have issues of LGBTQ folks and race. There are more Black LGBTQ folks in the South than any other region. For example, you also have the intersectionality of poverty, or you have the intersectionality, as you pointed out, of natural disasters, like what happened there in Asheville that was so devastating, or immigration status, right? How is it? How do you focus on the needs of every person, which to begin with, it's very individual. Even when you're talking about gender affirming healthcare, it's individual to the person, which is what makes these blanket policies even more nonsensical. But when you add these other factors in too, how do you see that playing out on the ground?
Yeah, that's such a critical issue. And we're certainly thinking of that as we look at some of the other executive orders around immigration in particularly, or around the rollback or attempted rollback of federal protections around civil rights and initiatives around equity and inclusion. I do want to, before talking too much about any of these executive orders, I do want to say that our analysis is that no one should overly comply or prematurely comply with these executive orders. Yeah. Many of them are vaguely or poorly written. They're going to be litigated if they're not already headed to the courts. And one of the things we don't want to do as we see all these creeping moves towards authoritarianism is concede or comply in any way that is premature or overly compliant. So I do want to just kind
No,
of get that in
and
there.
that's no, that's a really important question, really important point to make. And I will put in the show notes a column that I wrote this week in the Boston Globe, which I basically assess that most of these executive order, if not unconstitutional, or probably illegal, they fly in the face of federal law that already exists and is in place. They contradict previous Supreme Court precedent and other things. So I actually do think that these are winnable legal battles, and so that's a crucially important point. They should
I
not be
want to read
taken for
that.
granted.
I
Yes,
definitely want to
yes,
read that
I will.
column. I feel like you should be the one talking here. Um,
But that's a really important point because
oh, so
I don't
yeah,
want to see people scared off of
right.
getting the care that they need because they believe that they somehow will be in some sort of legal trouble. That is not true. We can probably expect, if it hasn't already by the time we're done talking, there might be already orders in place halting these executive orders from being enforced until they make it up the chain in those litigation challenges. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Well, no, and I think precisely to your original question, so much of this is about what individuals and families need, and how do we provide support and resources as people proceed in the way that they need to, feel ready to, are able to, and that is going to be different for every person, every family. And I also don't want to be overly glib around saying don't comply. There may well be people for whom that is the safest or best choice. And the approach we take, right, is trying to help people access the good, clear information. For instance, these are probably unconstitutional, right? But also access information about resources and support. One of the extraordinary things that has happened on the ground in the South, and we have seen it year over year since we launched about 13 years ago, is that more and more frontline providers have become LGBTQ inclusive. And that's really critical in a moment like this. A decade or so ago, a queer person would have to think long and hard before, say, they went to a disaster resource center in the wake of a hurricane or a legal aid center if they needed consultation around immigration rights in a crisis. Because they'd have to think about how their queer identity intersected with those other needs and whether they'd be met with hostility or whether they'd be met with discrimination. There's still a long way to go, but we are in a much different place than we were a decade ago in the sense that some of the organizations that are doing frontline work around immigration rights, for instance, excuse me, and racial justice work. And here in Western North Carolina, we're still in recovery mode from a hurricane. Are staffed by queer folks, are explicitly inclusive in their language, have a understanding of specific needs that queer individuals and families may have. So I think as we move forward, it's really important to talk about the strengths and assets that also exist and how the kind of change that has helped create and achieve that can't be undone. Even as we head into what we know will be a very tough 4 years, right? We have to understand that the work of past generations, the work of the past decade in particular, where we've seen such progress at the legal, policy, and cultural level, is not going to be undone simply because we're facing a hostile administration, and that support is there for folks as they navigate the intertwined issues in their lives. Part of my morning routine is that I check the mail for CSE at the local post office, which is where the passport office is. And recently, there's been long lines of families there to get their passports. My wife is an attorney. She was on the phone the other night, as dinner was cooking on the stove, calling families whose adoptions had just been approved, letting them know on the first day of the Trump administration that they had a new kind of legal protection in place. So what we are seeing on the ground is people taking the steps to prepare and protect themselves and doing that with the support of service providers, frontline folks who are ready to take that walk with them.
So I want to talk a little bit more about what organizations like yours need in this moment specifically. But I know one thing that I am seeing in comments and reactions to things that I've said and written are people who are saying, look, pushing this issue is why people are moving away from the left. This is too much social change happening too quickly, and it's going to backfire. What do you say to people who are saying this is too much, including lawmakers, including Democratic lawmakers,
Yeah.
that are saying this is too much? I don't know how I feel. It tends to go back to, in my opinion, the nonsensical threat of trans athletes in schools, as if they're harmful, as if trans kids in school are harmful to cisgender kids at all. They're not. But what do you say to people who are just like, this is too much change too quickly?
Well, to start with, that's something that queer folks have heard our entire lives in one way or another. And that generations before us heard as well. And that's something that's been, has shaped laws. It's shaped religious and political discourse and cultural discourse. We have always been told to stay quiet, to stay invisible, to hide who we are, and not to show up and say we want to be treated with the same equality and dignity as everyone else. So that, first of all, that's a familiar message.
Yeah.
And it harkens back to messages I think that every vulnerable community in one way or another has heard. It's not time. Let's not go too fast. But the other thing that I know, and I'm a queer Southerner, I'm a minister, I'm involved with politics, but the thing I know is that no one wants to be preached at, right? No one wants to be told why they're wrong and why you're right. And what I also know is that people are absolutely capable of having their heart changed, and their mind will follow, having their heart changed around LGBTQ issues. And that what 99.9% of the time makes that change is people having a relationship with someone who's, in this case, let's say trans.
Yeah.
And hearing their story and seeing their experience and getting to a place where seeing the pain and harm that someone is having to experience just to be in the world is no longer tolerable to them. And the moment they feel that, the whole scaffolding and architecture of that argument falls apart, because it's just clear, it's true, right? Queer people have always been here. And we are right now, as we were with marriage equality, say back in 1999, 2000, we are in a tough and critical chapter of the fight for full trans equality and inclusion. And beyond that, a much more nuanced and rich understanding of what gender is. And we are in the throes of, a battle that's playing out culturally, it's playing out politically, it's playing out in religious spaces about what gender means, how we live our lives, what we can do with our bodies. And trans folks are being scapegoated in all of that. And, ask people to connect the dots. So that's something that, we go to also is like, let's just step back here. But, I've been at this work for a long time, and I am surprised all the time, and I love that. And I'm wrong all the time, and I love that, because most of the time when I make an assumption about what someone believes on this issue, it turns out that they, I might make an assumption that they're hostile. It turns out they have a trans grandkid, and they're an incredible ally. I might make an assumption that someone can't move on this. A decade later, they have moved.
Yeah.
And that's one of the sources of this kind of relentless hope that we also feel in this work. This is a hard time. It's been for me, it's been a hard week for our team. It's been a hard week for me. Yeah. It's going to be a hard 4 years, and it's also not forever. And we hold on to that very tightly. And we know we're going to have to keep having this conversation because we've always had it.
Yeah.
We're probably going to be having it for the duration of our lifetimes in one form or another. I wish we weren't, but if what's on the other side of that is the possibility that a trans kid out there grows up with that much more love and support and resources on their journey, then it is well worth, in my opinion, well worth showing up to the table again with anyone who's willing to sit down at the table to talk about this stuff.
So, Jasmine, uh, what do your organization and organizations like yours need most in this moment? I always hear from my listeners, what can we do? We
Well, that's
appreciate this
first of all,
conversation. What can we do?
thank you to your listeners for asking that, and thank you to y'all for having us on, and taking some time to really shine a light on the experience of queer folks in the South. At the Campaign for Southern Equality, we are always so excited to have folks from any part of the country join us, join our mailing list, go to southernequality.org, become part of this movement. If you are compelled by the work we're doing, we would be honored if you donated. That money goes directly into projects like the Trans Youth Emergency Project. Um, there's lots of ways to volunteer. We have a book out in the world called Trans Kids, Our Kids, which tells a lot of the frontline stories of extraordinary families that we've been honored to work with in recent years. Moving that book and stories like that through the world is a powerful step to take no matter where you live. We also work with incredible partner organizations, whether it's the ACLU in terms of their state chapters and affiliates, or at the national level, Lambda, A4TE doing trans equality work, the Trans Law Center. They are scattered all over the country. There are also local LGBTQ community centers and youth serving organizations in many communities. Get in touch with folks locally, and just see if you can show up.
Yeah.
This is a moment when we need people to show up. And some of the things we need people to do are the simplest things in the world. It is just show up in body, mind, and spirit, express love and support, and help make sure that these frontline organizations that are going to be working directly with people to help people connect with resources have the funding they need, have the volunteer base they need, and have the support they need to not just sustain their programming, but to expand it, because that's what's going to need to happen as we look to the 4 years ahead. But
Yeah.
get involved. We know a majority of Americans are with us, and this is about building a movement that truly reflects that. And so there's room at the table for you, and we'd love to have you with us.
Yeah, and why we are focusing on the particular needs of folks in the South. We're seeing this now more than ever all across the country. I mean, a lot of the phone calls, texts that I've been getting, emails, are coming from places like Massachusetts, like Illinois, like places that you thought
Yeah.
maybe this would not be an issue, but it is. And all of these groups need help, but particularly there in the South. I thank you, Jasmine, for the work that you are doing, and I thank you for joining me on Justice by Design.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk with you. Thanks for all you do.
One of the things that really stays with me from the conversation with Jasmine is the talk about love, how LGBTQ folks, like all of us, need love. They need acceptance. They need to know that they're taken care of. They need to know that they're safe. We all need that. And I do agree with her that people don't like to be preached to. I'm an opinion columnist. So it's sort of my job to preach at people. And I do that a lot, especially on issues like this that I care so very much about. But I do want to leave with the thought about caring. I think about my family members who are LGBTQ, my friends, my colleagues, and their children, and just the amount of fear and anxiety that the actions by the President of the United States have caused in just the first few days of this administration is really something. So I really urge all of you to lean into that love. That may feel Pollyanna, it may feel like it's not important, but it is. And I too, as Jasmine stated, have seen people whose minds have changed from spending time with a trans grandchild or from spending time with a queer sibling that they didn't understand. I've seen that happen in my own family. And that's really where the most magical change is going to happen. It's not going to come from Washington, although that change is needed too. It's going to come from each and every one of us on the ground doing what is right and leading with love. Thank you for joining Justice by Design. I'm here every week talking about a topic and talking to the people who are on the ground, bringing about the solutions that we need to actually make justice a reality. So follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch the show every week, you can do so at Politicon's YouTube page. You can give us a like over there and subscribe. Follow us on where you get your pods and give us 5 stars, because that helps other people find this. I think these are conversations that the more people hear them, the better. I'm Kimberly Atkins Store. See you next week.